This episode of CrimeSynth discusses themes of domestic violence, emotional abuse, coercive control, and family side. While every effort has been made to approach the demise of the Cabading family with sensitivity, accuracy, and respect for the individuals involved, some content may be distressing or triggering to some listeners. The psychological and sociological frameworks discussed are intended to help illuminate patterns of behavior, not to excuse or absolve any acts of violence. If at any point you feel that this episode is too difficult to listen to or brings up distressing emotions, we completely understand. Please feel free to skip this episode and take care of yourself. We'll meet you again in the next one. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please seek support from mental health professionals, local authorities, or domestic violence hotlines in your area. You are not alone. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Parents are often described as loving their children deeply and unconditionally, sometimes to extremes, becoming either too lenient, inadvertently condoning misbehavior, or excessively strict and protective, limiting their child's independence out of fear for their future. This profound love can manifest as deep affection, protective instincts, and occasionally, strict rules aimed at guiding a child toward a better future. At certain developmental stages, children naturally seek autonomy, a psychological milestone known as individuation, where adolescents assert independence and establish their own identity separate from parental authority. Yet as children grow and begin making their own decisions, the boundary between reasonable parental guidance and dangerous authoritarian control can blur. When does a parent's strictness transition from being protective to becoming oppressive? At what point does love cease to nurture and instead start to suffocate? I'm the narrator and this is CrimeSynth, where we unravel the truth behind the headlines, layer by layer. Today, we explore a tragic case that challenges our understanding of family love and dynamics, authority and autonomy. In unraveling this story, we ask, when does parental love cross the line from right to dangerously wrong? Dr. Leonardo Quitangon, a 35-year-old physician, met Lydia Cabading, a promising 23-year-old medical intern at the University of Santo Tomas. Their relationship blossomed quietly, dates to the movies, and introductions to each other's families. But behind this ordinary love story lurked an unsettling tension. Lydia rarely spoke about her home life. Friends noticed her abrupt exits during social gatherings, always returning home early to appease her father, Pablo Cabading. Pablo, a police officer known for his stern authority, was intensely protective of Lydia, insisting on escorting her to school and confronting anyone he saw as a potential threat or possible suitor. When Leonardo asked Pablo for Lydia's hand in marriage, the approval came with heavy conditions: a lavish wedding and a substantial dowry of 5,000 pesos. At the time, this was a significant equivalent to over 500,000 pesos today. After negotiations, Leonardo managed to produce only 3,000 pesos and asked Pablo to reconsider the dowry amount, and Pablo, he relented. With one strict condition remaining, the couple must live under his roof on Zapote Street. According to Nick Joaquin's account, in the house on Zapote Street, Lydia and Leonardo were married on September 10, 1960, and began their new life within Pablo's home. But the anticipated joy quickly faded. Pablo's dominance intensified. He insisted the couple spend their evenings in the living room, constantly under his watchful gaze. He frequently accompanied them on outings, sitting next to Lydia at movie theaters and demanding the seat during car rides, relegating Leonardo to the back. Even when Lydia passed her medical board exams, Pablo excluded Leonardo from attending her oath-taking ceremony. He justified the exclusion by stating that only he and his wife had paid for Lydia's education and that Leonardo had no part in it. It was a move that further underscored Pablo's assertion of control over his daughter's life and choices. In one instance, when Leonardo's car broke down and he failed to return home before the curfew time set by Pablo, he was not allowed back in the house until the following day. an incident that revealed how even minor setbacks were met with disproportionate consequences. The pressure became unbearable for Leonardo, who eventually moved out alone, unable to convince Lydia to leave with him. Communication between the young couple grew scarce, tightly restricted by Pablo. One day, Leonardo visited briefly, delivering a gift to Lydia, waiting anxiously at the gate, permitted only a brief interaction. Recognizing the deepening crisis, their families arranged a meeting to resolve matters, resulting in Pablo agreeing, seemingly willing to grant the couple their independence. Yet this agreement proved deceptive. Pablo soon called Lydia back home, claiming her mother was gravely ill. In truth, Asuncion was not sick. She had only pretended to be ill at Pablo's instruction, a calculated move to lure Lydia back to the house. Once Lydia returned, Pablo insisted she remain permanently. The rising tension came to a tragic end on January 18, 1961. Pablo Cabading, a retired detective who had previously served in the Manila Police Department's Criminal Investigation Laboratory, gathered Lydia, Leonardo, and Asuncion into the second-floor bedroom of their home at 1074 Zapote Street in Makati. Claiming they were only going to resolve a family matter, he instead carried out a fatal attack. Lydia and Leonardo were later found lifeless, embracing in the corner of the room. Asuncion Cabading was gravely injured and rushed to the Philippine General Hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery. Pablo was discovered in the room as well, with a firearm recovered nearby. The space showed signs of a violent encounter that had been locked from the inside, prompting authorities to force their way in. The household staff Normalinda Gapos and Corazon Versosa alerted a nearby police officer after hearing the incident unfold. Leonardo's brother, Nonilo Kitangon, had been waiting downstairs, having been summoned earlier by Pablo, and heard the tragic sequence of events from below. Rodrigo Narvaez, a cousin of Leonardo, arrived shortly after being informed of the situation. Investigators retrieved the weapon from the scene and observed that this position raised doubts about the official sequence of events. Early accounts also suggested that Asuncion may have attempted to protect the couple in their final moments. Lydia too was believed to have shielded her husband in the chaos. The case made national headlines and became etched into Philippine cultural history. It was first retold by Nick Joaquin in this unsettling account, The House on Zapote Street, written under the pseudonym of Quijano de Manila and published in Reportage on Crime. In 1981, director Mike De Leon adapted elements of the story into the critically acclaimed film Kisap Mata. Both works immortalized the case as a haunting representation of patriarchal violence masked by domestic order. Investigators arrived at 1074 Zapote Street shortly after 5:45 p.m. on January 18, 1961. The alert came from the Cabading household staff, Normalinda Gapus and Corazon Versosa, who ran outside in a panic and flagged down a nearby Makati policeman after hearing what sounded like a disturbing commotion upstairs. Inside the house was also Nonilo Kitangon, Leonardo's brother, who had been asked by Pablo earlier that day to discuss a family matter. He had been told to wait downstairs. Moments later, he too heard the unsettling sounds that marked the final moments of a rising family crisis. The second-floor bedroom where the incident occurred was locked from the inside. Officers forced entry and encountered a grim and deeply disturbing scene. Dr. Leonardo Kitangon and Lydia Cabading were found unresponsive in the corner of the room, holding one another. Asuncion Cabading, though still alive, had sustained multiple serious injuries. She was immediately taken to the Philippine General Hospital for urgent care. Pablo Cabading was found in the room as well, with wounds indicating a fatal self-inflicted injury. The space bore signs of a violent struggle. The firearm, identified as Pablo's service-issued weapon, was recorded from the floor near his feet. Its location prompted early questions about the sequence of events and whether it aligned with an intentional act. No note was found. Police theorized that the positioning of the individuals in the room suggested protective instincts. Asuncion may have intervened, and Lydia appeared to have shielded her husband in her final moments. These elements, combined with eyewitness accounts and the locked room circumstances, pointed to a premeditated act carried out with emotional and psychological control. The forensic findings reinforce what had already begun to surface publicly: a house overshadowed by dominance and fear, ending not in just tragedy, but in haunting silence. By now, the story has unfolded. The timeline is clear. The evidence remains, recorded in reports and echoed in the silence that followed. But understanding this tragedy demands more than facts. We must ask, was this simply a case of mental instability? Or did cultural norms, gender roles, and psychological dynamics combine into a fatal storm? To answer that, we turn to the framework that help us decode the warning signs. Because until we understand the systems that shape Pablo Cabading's actions, we risk missing the very thing that could have stopped him. The tragedy that unfolded in the Cabading household was not a spontaneous act of madness. It was the final chapter of a long-standing pattern of control, fear, and psychological domination. Let's examine the key frameworks that help explain why this happened, each offering an insight into a different layer of the dynamic. This dynamic may reflect what psychologist Kenneth Adams described as emotional incest, a non-sexual but emotionally entangled parent-child relationship where boundaries collapse. It is a form of boundary violation in which a parent turns to their child to fulfill emotional and psychological needs that should be typically met by another adult, often placing the child in the role of a surrogate partner or companion. This dynamic can lead to an enmeshed relationship where the child feels responsible for the parent's emotional well-being, creating a deep bind of loyalty, guilt, and confusion. Psychologist Kenneth M. Adams, in his book Silently Seduced: When Parents Make Their Children Partners, explains how this over-reliance on a child fosters unhealthy emotional entanglement and blurred relational boundaries. In Pablo Cabading's case, several behaviors suggest this form of enmeshment, which include the exclusion of Leonardo from Lydia's oath-taking and asserting that only he and his wife were responsible for Lydia's success, thereby preserving Lydia's loyalty to the parental unit, insisting that the couple live under his roof even after marriage, and dictating Lydia's movements, including escorting her to and from school and managing who she spent time with. These actions reflect a dynamic in which Pablo viewed Lydia not as an autonomous adult, but as an emotional extension of himself. Her attempts at independence threatened that bond, leading to possessiveness and eventual violence. Family systems theory, developed by psychiatrist Salvador Minuchin and expanded by Murray Bowen, offers critical insights on how patterns within a family unit can shape individual behavior, emotional roles, and relational dynamics. Minuchin's foundational work, Families and Family Therapy, explored how rigid hierarchies, enmeshment, and closed relational systems contribute to dysfunction. Bowen, in Family Therapy in Clinical Practice, introduced concepts such as emotional fusion, triangulation, and differentiation of self, suggesting that unresolved emotional bonds within families often perpetuate intergenerational stress and emotional conflict. In the case of the Cabading family, these frameworks appear particularly applicable. The household was structured around Pablo's dominant role, with few opportunities for shared authority or open dialogue. Asuncion, Lydia's mother, often aligned herself with Pablo's decisions, including participating in the strategy that led Lydia to return home. Lydia was not given space to mature in her adult identity. Instead, she remained confined to expectations shaped by the family narrative and hierarchy. Within such a closed and inflexible system, efforts to assert autonomy, such as Lydia's marriage or her desire to live independently, created systemic tension. In Bowen's terms, her individuation may have been experienced by the family unit as a threat to cohesion, prompting defensive responses that escalated the emotional pressure within the home. Coercive control theory, developed by sociologist and forensic social worker Evan Stark, reframes domestic abuse not as a collection of isolated outbursts, but as a sustained pattern of psychological control aimed at limiting a person's autonomy. In his seminal work Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, Stark emphasizes that the essence of this dynamic lies not always in the visible acts of violence, but in subtle, persistent behaviors that diminish a person's freedom, agency, and sense of self. Core tactics Stark identifies include emotional manipulation, over-monitoring, restricting access to social connections, and controlling daily routines. These behaviors often evolve gradually, creating an environment where the affected individual may feel psychologically cornered. The goal, according to Stark, is not necessarily physical harm, but emotional compliance and perceived dependence. When examining the Cabading family through this framework, certain patterns emerge that align with the dynamic Stark describes. Pablo's insisting on extorting Lydia to and from school, and later requiring that she and her husband live in the family home. His habit of closely accompanying them on outings, minimizing privacy by placing himself in close physical and social proximity, excluding Leonardo from key milestones, such as Lydia's professional oath-taking, structuring their time, such as requiring them to spend evenings in a shared family space, or directing sleeping arrangement in ways that limited the couple's intimacy. Enforcing rigid household schedules and curfews, which reduce the couple's independence. These behaviors, when viewed collectively, suggest a pattern of intensified authority and diminishing relational boundaries. Within this context, attempts by Lydia and Leonardo to establish autonomy, such as marriage or requesting privacy, may have been perceived as disruptions to the household's established structure. Stark's theory also explains why psychological control often escapes public scrutiny. Because it leaves no physical marks, its effects can be minimized or dismissed, despite its long-term emotional toll. In Lydia's case, it invites us to consider how systems of control can take hold quietly, and why they can be so difficult to recognize or confront. Rooted in indigenous Filipino psychology and cultural psychology, the honor-shame framework provides insight into how moral behavior, identity, and social expectations shape individual actions, especially within highly relational and community-centered cultures. In contrast to Western guilt-based frameworks, which emphasize internal conscience and personal responsibility, Filipino psychology often places moral weight on social perception. Two central values, hiya and dangal, serve as emotional and social regulators of behavior. Hiya refers to the desire to avoid bringing embarrassment not only to oneself but to one's family or social group. It acts as a self-policing mechanism that discourages deviation from communal norms. Dangal, by contrast, reflects one's sense of personal and familiar honor, how one is perceived in terms of respectability, pride, and public worth. In some tragic cases involving interpersonal harm within families, overwhelming experiences of hiya and perceived threats to dangal may contribute to deep psychological strain. The fear isn't always external judgment. It can stem from an internalized sense of social failure or imagined disgrace. When applied to the case of Pablo Cabading, this framework offers a lens to understand the cultural pressures that may have shaped his worldview. Lydia's professional achievements as a physician may have been perceived by Pablo, who, as reports suggest, did not complete his law degree and was already retired, as a disruption of traditional family hierarchy. In patriarchal settings, such a reversal in perceived status can be interpreted as a threat to masculine identity and family pride. Lydia's increasing independence, her plans to move out, marry, and live apart might have triggered fears of public perception that Pablo was no longer in control or that his authority has eroded. This goes beyond familiar concern. It touches on perceived loss of face in one's social environment. Phrases such as mapapahiya ako carry deep cultural significance, especially for individuals operating within frameworks of traditional authority. In such settings, a perceived loss of control is not only personal, it can also be interpreted as social failure. This lens does not justify harmful behavior, but it helps us understand how cultural values, when combined with rigid gender roles and internalized expectations, can intensify psychological distress in high-stakes family dynamics. Emerging from sociology, gender studies, and critical theory, patriarchal power theory explores how male-dominated systems influence both public institutions and private life, especially within the family. At its core, patriarchy refers to a structure in which men hold disproportionate authority, with power reinforced through cultural expectations, legal norms, and religious ideologies. This framework interprets controlling behaviors not as isolated outbursts, but as socially patterned responses to perceived challenges against male authority. Rather than viewing these behaviors as purely individual or impulsive, patriarchal power theory sees them as emerging from a broader system that reinforces certain forms of dominance and discourages female autonomy. Applied to the Cabading case, this lens offers critical insight. Pablo's resistance to Lydia leaving the household or making independent decisions may reflect patriarchal expectations about the father's continued authority over daughters, even into adulthood and marriage. His close regulation of Lydia and Leonardo's relationship, like dictating where they lived, how they spent time, and how their privacy was structured, can be interpreted as an effort to maintain control aligned with patriarchal norms. Religious and cultural influences may have reinforced a worldview in which obedience to paternal authority was seen not just as expected, but morally imperative. When Lydia began asserting her autonomy and Leonardo challenged Pablo's control, these actions may have been perceived by Pablo as threats to the established family hierarchy. Within this theoretical framework, the tragedy is not viewed in isolation, but as part of a wider pattern in which authority figures, particularly men in patriarchal settings, may feel compelled to reassert control when traditional structures are destabilized. Patriarchal power theory does not excuse harmful actions, but it helps us understand how cultural, gendered, and structural forces can influence the psychology of control and contribute to conflict escalation within families. How Pablo Cabading treated Lydia and his family cannot be viewed as a singular, isolated act. It was the tragic result of multiple psychological, cultural, and structural forces intersecting within one household. The frameworks we've explored, emotional enmeshment, family systems, coercive control, honor-shame dynamics, and patriarchal power, each offer a valuable lens through which to understand the dynamics at play. But no single theory explains the full picture. It is the convergence of these forces that likely intensify the emotional and relational tension within the Cabading household. Pablo's close emotional entanglement with Lydia blurred the line between parental care and dependency. Family systems theory revealed households structured around fixed roles and rigid authority, leaving little room for healthy individuation. Patterns of coercive control limited Lydia's autonomy in subtle, day-to-day ways that appeared protective on the surface. Cultural expectations surrounding honor and shame may have transformed her independence into a perceived loss of face, and patriarchal power theory helps us understand how deeply held beliefs about male authority can influence behavior in private, emotionally charged contexts. This wasn't simply the story of one individual's personal struggle. It reflects how broader systems of power, identity, and emotional regulation may interact in high-stress family environments. The combined pressure of these dynamics may have shaped how Pablo perceived Lydia's autonomy, not as a natural expression of adulthood, but as a challenge to his role, identity, and control. From this perspective, what unfolded was not merely personal. It was relational, systemic, and deeply embedded in larger cultural meanings. When control becomes equated with love and obedience becomes a marker of worth, the breakdown of that system can be profoundly destabilizing. Only by examining the interplay of these forces can we begin to name, recognize, and critically reflect on the social and emotional patterns that contribute to tragedies such as this one, so that we might better understand how to interpret them before they escalate. The Cabading Family Tragedy invites us to look beyond individual choices and into the broader systems that shape them. Systems that can make certain patterns of control seem acceptable, even invincible, until irreversible harm occurs. When control is framed as discipline, when silence is interpreted as respect, and when obedience is seen as a measure of love, a troubling pattern can emerge, one where protection becomes indistinguishable from domination and autonomy is perceived as defiance. What makes this case especially unsettling is its familiarity. The behaviors associated with Pablo, close monitoring, emotional dependence, and the use of guilt or shame, are not unfamiliar to many. These patterns are often embedded within cultural expectations and family norms quietly passed down and rarely questioned. This leaves us with more than sorrow. It leaves us with reflection. We are called to ask difficult questions, to recognize early signs of unhealthy relational dynamics, to examine traditions that may unintentionally normalize control in intimate relationships. The story of the Cabading family is not only one of personal tragedy, it also reflects a deeper, more systemic failure to recognize and respond to troubling patterns. Patterns where silence is chosen over confrontation, control over connection, and appearances over truth. As we've explored throughout this episode, this was not just the case of one person losing control. It was the result of intersecting forces, rigid family expectations, cultural reinforced gender roles, unspoken emotional burdens, and relational dynamics that went unexamined for too long. Pablo's actions were devastating, but they also followed recognizable patterns. And unless we learn to name and question those patterns, we risk overlooking them in the spaces closest to us. The case about the house on Zapote Street doesn't just belong to the past. It echoes in every home where silence takes the place of honest conversation, where control wears the mask of care, and where obedience is expected without question. In Pablo, we see a man shaped by the cultural script of his time, but we also see how that script can unravel when love turns into ownership. And yet, the values that shape that script, like obedience to one's parents, modesty, and deep familial love, are not lost in our culture. They are, in many ways, its strength. These ideals have shaped generations of Filipinos, instilling respect, humility, and loyalty. But like all virtues, they must be held in balance. When obedience is demanded instead of earned, when modesty becomes silence, and when love is expressed through control, the very values meant to protect can begin to cause harm. In the most tragic cases, they don't just wound, they silence. So we're left with a difficult but necessary question. Where is the line between discipline and domination, between love and control, between protection and possession? These aren't questions with easy answers, but asking them may be the first step in honoring the best of our traditions, while learning to recognize when those same traditions have been distorted. And yet, for all the frameworks we've examined, so much still remains unknowable. We will never fully hear Lydia's voice, her dreams, her hesitations, her inner world. We don't know what Asuncion truly felt about the roles she was asked to play in that household, whether she agreed, feared, or simply endured. We may never learn how Leonardo processed his place in the family, or how deeply he grieved the distance between himself and the woman he loved. These silences are not just gaps in the story. They are symptoms of the very system we've been trying to understand. Systems that control by suppressing expression, that preserve order by denying space for dissent. And so, we remember not just what happened, but also what was never said. So now the question turns inward. How do we love without control? How do we offer protection without overreach? How do we support autonomy in cultures that have long prized obedience? Because ultimately, this isn't just the Cabading story. It is a cautionary tale about the hidden dynamics that shape relationships, families, and communities. If this episode stirred something in you, we invite you to reflect on what roles control, silence, or emotional obligation may play in your own relationships. Let this be more than a story. Let it be a moment of awareness. If control ever disguises itself as love in your life, will you notice before the consequences deepen beyond repair? This is CrimeSynth. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.